Good afternoon. We have the pleasure, the honor, and the privilege to have with us today Dr. Rudolf Marcus, professor at Caltech, US, and Nanyang Technical University in Singapore. All of you know who is Professor Marcus and how important is his contribution to the theory of electron transfer reaction in chemical systems. He started his career in 1948, and he published hundreds of papers. And in 1956, he published his first paper on the theory of oxidation-reduction reactions involving electron transfer. And he awarded the Nobel Prize in 1992. And I'm proud to say also that he awarded the Lavoisier Medal from the French Chemical Society in 1994. He's still very active in research, and he's here today with us to give a lecture about his very recent results and works. So please, Professor Marcus, join us.
Well, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here and to hear of all the recent developments. At times, I've worked largely in some other fields beside electron transfer in recent years, and it's like the Rip Van Winkle story that wakes up many years later and sees how many new things have developed. And of course, a fantastic number of new things have developed. And anyways, we thought we'd try to be part of it with the research group. So today I'd like to talk about a couple of topics. So let me see about getting this started here. Okay. I didn't know one had to still be an experimentalist. Okay, range slideshow, play from the start. No, let's do this one. I think this will do it. Let's see if it does it. Will it come up? Yes, good. Science is wonderful, isn't it? Engineering too, I guess. All right, well, today I'd like to talk about several topics involving semiconductors. One of them is the field of quantum dots, and the other is one of the elementary steps that's used in some solar cells, the initial steps. Both of these happen to involve electron transfer, and that was the reason for our getting into it. And they each have their own fascinations and their own headaches. And it's been interesting to see how the fields in each of them developed, and I'd like to say something about those developments and development of the theory. An outline of what I'll be talking about is the first part deals with quantum dots and their intermittency. As you know, many different kinds of species, when they're irradiated, go on and off as far as emitting light. And one of these are the small semiconductor nanoparticles that we'll be talking about. There are many others. There are various light harvesting photosynthetic systems. There are various reactions going on surfaces. Anyways, this is one of them. And we'll talk about some of the experimental results and some of the newer developments that explain some problems that we didn't understand previously. And some might argue we still don't understand, but I'll debate that a little bit. Anyways, that would be the first part of the talk. And then the second part I'll say a little bit about recent work on curved Tafel plots and the whole question of Butler-Volmer theory and the theory that permits instead curved Tafel plots. And we'll talk about some work of the Entman fluorescence type on dyes and semiconductors and the difference between going into the conduction band and into the band gap, the difference in kinetic properties. And this will include work not only on nanoparticles but also on a flat surface. And if there's time permits, we'll say a little bit about detailed kinetics in the solar cells. All right, well, the next slide is a schematic picture of a quantum dot. This happens to be a cadmium selenide with a quantum dot with a thin layer of zinc sulfide around it and something to protect the whole thing. These are trioctal something or other, topo it's called. And if you wanted, you could attach various things to it and use it as sensors. So this is what we'll be talking about. And of course, since it's a confined system, instead of having a continuum levels, it has a discrete set of levels. And here's an STM diagram. This is blown up here. Huh, this one isn't working. No. I've always learned all these years to bring a spare, but it may not work either. Yeah, it works. All right, we'll see. All right, and so here's this STM, and here are these different energy levels, these discrete levels. The ones for holes are more closely spaced. So this is one of the various kinds of studies that are made to try to characterize quantum dots. And this intermittent fluorescence is exhibited here. These are, you shine light on the quantum dot, and sometimes it fluoresces, and you continue shining light, and then it stops, and then it fluoresces again. And so you get these so-called trajectories of light on and off. And you can see that these are relatively nice trajectories, a little bit like a picket fence. This one isn't so nice, but nice trajectories. And there's certain experimental results, generalizations that emerge, and they're, I think, crucial in suggesting what kind of theory to work with. And for example, here is a power law. This is a plot of the probability of having a trajectory of certain length and time versus the length and time, only it's a log-log plot. And you get nice straight lines for the so-called off period when it's dark. You have plots like that for the on period when it's light, and plots like the distribution of times for the off period. And inevitably, the off period ones are all lovely, nice like that. And if you look at the distribution of slopes for many different studies, they tend to center around minus 1.5. In other words, this probability varies as t to the minus 1.5 power. Now, what can you deduce from that? Well, it depends on how seriously you take the 1.5. It's the figure that most often comes up in experiments. And one explanation when you see a fractional power like that is that you immediately think of some kind of diffusion process. We'll see a couple of examples of that, this one. And this is the one that we favor. There's, of course, always a different theory in the field. And this theory, a fairly popular theory, says, no, the origin is quite different. That you toss out the electron, and that makes it dark, and there's a reason why it would make it dark. And there are certain tunneling probabilities of coming back to make it light. And if you make some assumption about the distribution of those tunneling probabilities, and remember the tunneling probability itself depends exponentially on the distance. If you make some assumption about the distribution of distances, you can get a power law out of it. But you won't get 1.5. You'll get almost anything within a certain within a certain numerical range. So much depends upon on how much credence you give to the 1.5. But there are many plots like the one that I've shown up there. Here's another, I guess, where it's centered around the 1.5 and so on. There's an asymmetry about the off period and the on periods. The off periods, nice linear slope, 1.5, but the on periods, and almost doesn't matter what sort of area one's talking about, there's an exponential tail that occurs. And that's explaining it for a while was elusive. How would you get an exponential tail? Well, I'll mention a couple of ways, but I'll mention what I believe is the correct way now. When one plots that tail, if you plot in a certain way, you get a quadratic dependence on the light intensity. So whatever the explanation is, somehow the light intensity is causing the exponential tail. If you look at things a bit more finely, look in the nanosecond region of any one of those lines, then you see the following, that when you get the full light period, you get a single exponential decay of the fluorescence in the nanosecond region. Before we were talking about milliseconds. But the fluorescence itself is about nanoseconds. But when you get not the full thing, but partial one, and there's an example, then you get a bi or multi-exponential, and here's an example. So that's another thing to explain. And what we've done is try to explain things like that. There's one, before we go into a little bit in the theory, there's one other aspect. Of course, sometimes one thinks when there's a new method that, it's the answer to everything. Single molecule, answer to everything. But we also know that single molecule and ensemble results are really complementary. You can't get everything from single molecules. And the reason why is that to reach an equilibrated condition, or a steady state, or equilibrated condition, might take an hour. But these trajectories, you see the results, they start spreading, after maybe 10 seconds, or maybe at most 100 seconds. So you need the ensemble data, because the ensemble data, reaching the steady state, it's fine if many of them have taken an hour, that doesn't matter. You still get a steady state. But the signal is simply too weak in a single molecule experiment. So these things are really complementary, and in fact, in order to evaluate some of the quantities that appeared in the theory, we really needed to draw on both. This is an example of an ensemble data. It's plotted in a certain way, and essentially, though, it goes on, you can see, for 1,000 seconds until you finally reach some kind of a steady state. So whatever theory one has to take that into account and account for both types of data. All right, how to explain this in terms of an electron transfer mechanism, in terms of one that involves some sort of diffusion, and also what kind of diffusion are we talking about? Well, these parabolas may seem familiar to you. I hope as familiar to you as they are to me. But conventionally in electron transfer, you plot this free energy versus a reaction coordinate. Remember, this free energy is the result of working on a surface of, let's say, 10 to the 23rd coordinates, finding a global reaction coordinate, which we did in a 1960 paper. It was the difference of potential energies of the products and reactants. That was a global reaction coordinate. And you could define then a statistical mechanics based on that. And you could plot the free energy versus this global reaction coordinate. So it wasn't just a bond length or some solvent dipole. It was everything, so to speak, but defined in a very specific way. And in an electron transfer reaction, then, you start from the reactants, you have fluctuations, you get to near this intersection of the reactants and the products curve, and then there's a certain probability you'll go over, and if you do, then an electron transfer has occurred. Well, what's the difference between that and quantum dots? And how does electron transfer come into quantum dots? Well, the standard assumption, and the one that we will make, is that the dots become dark for a certain reason. You shine light, then if somehow one of the particles gets trapped on the surface, before the next light pulse comes in, you got one particle hanging around free in the center, inside the dot, and the other one's trapped. Now when a new excitation occurs, then you can have what's called an Auger process, where I'll show a specific example later, whereby one of those particles goes up while the other goes down. You've conserved energy, and but you haven't fluoresced. So you've lost, the system is dark. All right, well now, remembering that, how does one treat this, this on and off thing? Well, whereas in a thermal electron transfer you're starting here, actually in these quantum dots, when you're going from one dark to light or light to dark, which correspond to, one corresponds to one electronic state, the other corresponds to another, you're starting there at the intersection. That's the switching, that's the on, and that's also the off. So you're initially on one of these curves around there, you diffuse to around there, and then there's a chance that you'll cross over, in which case you're now either in the light or the dark state, depending on how they're labeled. Of course, I've exaggerated the curvature of these things. These things are practically flat in these systems. There's essentially almost no Stokes shift. So, anyway, so this is an exaggeration of the curvature. But you get the idea that in a quantum dot, going from on to off or off to on in this model, starts there, not down there. That'd be for a thermal reaction. So you start there and you diffuse, and when you come back in a certain probability, you can, undergoing electronic transition, you can go from light to dark, dark to light. Now, to get equilibration is a long time thing. That means you've got to explore this region as well as exploring this region here. And that's the thing that takes hours. Whereas going around here and there is a matter of, let's say, 10 seconds or something like that. So your times are much shorter for the study of these power laws than for achieving actual equilibration. All right. What equation should one use? Well, the idea of what's called spectral diffusion was introduced into this whole field many years ago. I know Buendia introduced it. Oh, well, maybe somebody did it before him. And the idea is that the difference of energy between one electronic state and the other is, they say, the spectral absorption or the spectral fluorescence. Let's say the fluorescence. And now, if the system somehow diffuses on that one-dimensional plot, along that reaction coordinate, then you get a slightly different vertical difference, larger or smaller, depending on what direction you diffuse. And so you'll get a fluctuation in the fluorescence line, the position of the fluorescence line. So the spectral diffusion, the diffusion of that line, is a measure of diffusion on those surfaces. So you use an equation which is a diffusion equation. That's what this is supposed to be. This is a diffusion operator. That's derivative with respect to time. And then you put in your terms for the electron transfer. And it's interesting. One of the terms says the electron transfer occurs when you're at that intersection. So that's this term there, and has a delta Q someplace in there, saying that it's localized right at that, when it reaches that intersection with certain details of transfer from one state to another. That's the term that goes from one state to the other. But there's another term we put in here, and this is new in the theory. Namely that supposing it happens, especially if you have an intense light source, supposing it happens that you have two excitons at once. Now a transition becomes possible. I mean, now you have twice as much energy as you had before. So now a transition becomes possible that one electron will take all the energy and be thrown out, take the energy of one going down while it goes up, and hence no fluorescence, and it'll have such a high energy, it doesn't need a resonance type thing. It's like a Fermi golden rule thing. It's thrown out. Well, for that type of process, you don't use this curve crossing thing. You use a Fermi golden rule thing where it's just thrown out. And that's what this term does here. And the probability of that happening, the probability of a biexciton, of course, depends on the square of the light intensity. And now, that's what we have for when it's bright. When it's dark, you remember there's no exponential tail. Well, how do you explain that? The explanation is straightforward. When you have a dark condition, the chance of having two excitons there is very small. Because of the dark condition, this Auger process can occur, whereby when you excite the first one, almost immediately, it can undergo an Auger process where one goes up and another goes down. And so you don't have the probability of having that biexciton hanging around long. You have a competitive process. So that's the asymmetry that we're using to explain the difference between light and dark and so on. Now, as you know, in theory, it's possible to derive very complicated expressions. And they're messy. In fact, if you look, say, at the 1956 electron transfer, it's a long time ago. If you look at the 1956 electron transfer paper, and you look at the derivation, and you look in the middle of it, you won't see that nice simple expression, lambda plus delta G squared. No, you won't see that. You'll see something like this. And I was wondering at the time what to do with something like this. I mean, how do you present something like that to experimentalists? But then on looking at it, I realized if I applied certain electrostatic theorems and so on, that I could simplify it. And all of a sudden, it was just like a split second, this very simple expression emerged. I didn't anticipate or anything. It's just when you introduce these equalities, I mean, there are no further approximations. These were exact after that. The whole thing simplified. So that sometimes happens. Oh, something else happened here. Let's see, how do I get back here? Here we are. Okay. Oh, I guess it turns itself off if you spend too much time talking, doesn't it? I know it's trying to tell one something, but what can you do? All right. Well, anyways, here's the expression that comes from solving that diffusion equation. This is the on period, so it has that exponential tail in there. And it's true, this is for the given problem, that's an exact solution, but it's messy, isn't it? Now, sometimes when you have solutions, the entire solution isn't necessarily of particular interest. Part of it may be related to a sort of domain where you don't investigate experimentally. So you look at certain asymptotic approximations at longer time or shorter time, and so on. And you find something like this. This probability distribution at very short times behaves a 1 over square root, and longer times, forget about the exponential, behaves as 1 over t cubed, and at still longer times, this k kicks in, and you get this 1 over t cubed times an exponential. So these are the forms that are relevant for comparing with experiments, although this is the sort of exact result for that problem. Anyways, there's a prediction that there will be, if you forget about that, in the power at times, and such a change was found. This is some work with Pelton. Some years ago, you see a change in the power, and the change is, the absolute value of the change is fine. And the reason, for any of these things, there's always a physical reason for it. And of course, always one should try to see the physical reason. It's not just mathematics, is it? So in this case, when you switch from one to the other at that intersection point, it takes a little while to build up a steady state of the new concentration relative to that intersection point. And that's, you can show, we mentioned in one of the papers, that's responsible for this change in slope that occurs. All right, here's a picture of the Auger process. All right, here's a quantum dot. Here are the levels. Here's a couple of electrons in a trap. This is cadmium selenide, so this would be a selenium ion on the edge of the quantum dot. It's not stabilized as much as the interior ones. And if you shine light, then you excite an electron. And then, of course, often it'll fluoresce. That's what it'll do most of the time. But sometimes it'll do something else. In other words, if there's a certain probability that from the trap, instead of it coming back, this one sends a certain probability of jumping down and getting rid of that hole. And now you end up with a trapped electron or a trapped hole and an extra electron in the thing. So this is the dark period. This would be before this was the light period. When you have this as a dark period, and you can see why it's dark from this thing here. There it is. Now we shine light, and let's see if what happens. It rises. That's the result of the light. And what happens next? Well, it might fluoresce, but the chances are bigger, you can show, that it comes down like that. One goes down while the other goes up. That's an Auger process. And of course, that has involved no fluorescence, so it's dark. So anyways, this is an example of the model. Anyways, this work, this latest version, appeared earlier this year in PCCP. I guess it's supposed to appear June 7th, I think. All right. Let's look at some recent results on the so-called curved Tafel plots. And you remember for the longest period of time, there was an effort to see if the Tafel plots, which are normally straight lines, were curved. The theory that we developed said they should be curved, but that didn't convince people. They thought they should try to find experimental evidence for it. So there's a major effort. And you remember that effort for the longest time was nothing. When you had a reaction that was sufficiently fast that it might get into the curve region, all of a sudden diffusion control took over, and so you weren't studying electron transfer as a slow rate anymore. And then you remember that Chitsey came along, and with one of these thioalkane surface and a ferrocene there, and now there's no diffusion. So now that's not a barrier, and you remember he found these curve plots in this paper in Science in 1991. Now, more recently in the nano field, a number of curve plots have been found, and here's an example This is from a paper, Besant in Nature 2014, and it's this. It's a complicated system. This lithium iron phosphate, and anyways, he measured results for it, and here are these curved Tafel plots that he's found. Now, one might argue with the interpretation. I haven't looked into it, but the main thing now is that one's getting curved plots. Of course, the key thing is interpretation. And yeah, I guess that's it. I had another one, but didn't. Okay, let's look at some things involved in solar energy conversion, and this blinking on surfaces and the type of theory one might use there. All right, here's the photosynthetic reaction center and the membrane. And you recall that what happens in a photosynthetic reaction center, this is a bacterial one. You have a special pair of bacterial chlorophylls. There's a light harvesting bacterial chlorophylls around. They gather and they concentrate their light right in that special pair. And the idea is that you want to transfer a charge across this bilayer membrane, and in the process also do things that build up a hydrogen ion concentration, which can drive ATP and so on. So it's a fairly complicated system. It has many functions. It's not just to use solar energy, but and you recall what happens. The electron, the excitation is gathered, it's transferred to the special pair. There's a certain probability that an electron will jump between some porphyrin-like molecules, eventually coming to some quinones and jump over. And here you have a channel that the QH2 can eventually come out, and then you can get other things happening. So what this does is it creates an ion gradient, it creates an electric field, a charge, and does all sorts of things with it. Of course, there's been a very active area of study, and you may recognize there are 4 or 5 Nobel Prizes in there. Imagine one diagram. One of them is, well, one time I asked an audience, you recognize what they were, and only one person put up their hand. I mean, probably here many people know, but only one person put up their hand, and he had been on the Nobel committee, you see. So anyways, one was for the structure of this reaction center. Another was for the structure of this ATPase. Another was for the whole idea of what's involved in the hydrogen ion migration, Mitchell hypothesis, and something like this was even cited in the electron transfer in the Nobel Prize that we got. So, all right. So, anyways, this has been an active field of study, and it's a way of harnessing solar energy. And sometimes you will hear in the solar energy devices that people are really trying to follow the leaf. Well, I don't know that's the case. Certainly, you want to get a charge separation. But this system does many things beside producing a charge separation across there. So it's actually, its overall efficiency for that is really small. And in a solar cell, you recall well, at least an earlier version of solar cell, now perovskite seems to be the thing. You excite a dye, and it can go into a conduction band of the titanium dioxide. That's what's there. These are the ion. These are these S's, and here's the TiO2. It can go in there and eventually go to an electrode, and you can take this dication and reduce it. Anyways, you produce the current that way in the system. So we thought we'd look at some of the kinetics that have been published on this. And what we hadn't done was to look at a picture of the of this titanium dioxide film. And this is a picture that I learned about later. And I think that if we'd seen this picture, we would never have thought of possibly trying to use a simple model to treat the data. But anyways, we hadn't seen the picture, so that's all right. The data turned out to be beautiful. This is from a paper of Zhao in 2009. You notice this picket fence-like behavior. It's great. Anyways, we thought we might try to treat that. This is a power law that was found, and these are a couple of things. Things are more scattered than they were with the other. Now the slope, it's scattered, but the slope now is near 1. And so you want to, whatever theory you have, you want to account for that slope of near 1. Here's another one. And this is the dark period of fluctuation. And this is light, and so on. And this is actually on a beautiful surface. This is a flat aluminum oxide surface. And I guess, this is just, I think it's the same thing. Just, oh yeah, there's on and off periods and so on. I won't worry about that. So what about the theory? Well, now the theory is a bit different because now you're exciting a dye, you eject an electron into the conduction band. So now this is a particle that's physically moving around. So now you use diffusion theory not of a reaction coordinate, but of an actual particle. And so once again, you solve a certain diffusion equation. It's the one that you expect, and you get a solution, Bessel functions for that kind of symmetry. But what's of interest, really, are these limiting forms, and there at very short times you get this behavior. And here's the time of interest, t minus 1. The difference between these two, anytime you see a difference, you wonder why. And you can quickly show, we mentioned why. In this case, at very short times, the electron that's moving away from the dye doesn't realize it's moving away from a semicircle. At very short times, it thinks it's moving away from a plane, so it behaves that behavior. Then later on, it's going now into a radius-dependent thing, and you get a higher power. You go from -1 to half to 1 there. Anyways, this is a picture of this, and it's consistent. Well, people haven't observed this earlier period, but this is consistent with what's found in these kind of systems. What time do we have?
5 minutes.
5 minutes, all right. You know, in theory, as you know, it's always good to focus on the experiment and not to treat the problem just as a statistical model or applying statistical ideas to like this on-off period. And for example, the type of systems that we've been treating have these nice picket-like fence pictures. And that's consistent with the kind of model we're using. But if you look at some other systems that I haven't talked about, for example, nanorods, or some biological systems where you can have triplet states and various other things, you find that by and large, they're not these nice on and off periods. So what that means is really, I think it's a foolish exercise to try to force a theory onto a situation for which it isn't applicable. So for those systems, I think one has to devise a different theory, and I could explain why, that is not just as simple as this, but takes into account that you don't have that nice picket fence thing. You have to explain it, and so on. But I think so often in the field, people just regard on, off, and decide where they're going to decide what's on and what's off and do the statistics. But that's really not physics. It's not chemistry. It's statistics. Well, this is a summary then. What we try to do, this power law, I mentioned this, what I call distributed rate constants thing, this tunneling from a distance and so on, that some people favor. And then I spoke about this exponential cutoff and the role played by excitons and various other experimental tests, and we made predictions. You know, it's interesting. There's some predictions I haven't mentioned here. But sometimes there can be a huge number of experiments, but they haven't necessarily tackled a particular aspect, simply because they perhaps didn't have a sort of a basic theory to really apply, to look for it, and so on. Anyways, this theory does suggest some things to do. And on the dyes and semiconductors, we mentioned the power law. TiO2 is a question of injection into the titanium dioxide band. In the case of aluminum oxide, that was that flat layer. That band is so large that the injection from a dye really goes into the band gap, doesn't go into the other. And so in that case, when you look at it and you think about what's involved, that something has to meet it, a hole has to meet it, diffuse towards it, and so on, to go in, the injection power law exists for both the going in and the coming out, whereas when it goes into the band gap, when it goes into the conduction band, there's no power law from that, it just goes in. But the coming back is dropped down to traps and diffusing back, then you have the power law there. So that's sort of a difference that you'd expect on physics ground is observed in actual systems. Okay, well, anyways, that's a brief sojourn into some of these diffusion problems, both along a reaction coordinate and in real space. Thank you.
So the paper is open for questions. Yeah.
So in this aluminum oxide case,
Right.
where is this electron going? Aluminum
It's
oxide.
going into the band gap. It's going into the band gap. And unlike the other ones, the titanium dioxide, you don't have a power law for the going in. For the aluminum oxide one, you have a power law. In other words, something is diffusing to meet it so it can go in. That's the model.
There's no state in there that it's finding aluminum oxide.
There's some trap or what have you, something that's capable of diffusing. Yeah. That's, I mean, there's a very distinct difference in the behavior of the aluminum oxide for the injection part, a power law for it, and the titanium dioxide, where it goes into the conduction band, no power law for that part.
But in this experiment, is there a fairly big applied potential in addition to
This experiment, I think, has no applied potential.
no applied potential?
I believe so. Unless they did it without stating it in the paper. No. No, I think this is no applied potential.
This is about the curved Toffel plot. I thought I understood in case of Chidsey, Murray et al.
Right.
That when you went up to high overpotential, it leveled out.
Yes, that's right.
But you showed a case on one of the slides that showed apparently an inversion layer.
That was it's an interesting point. That was a semiconductor, and Chidsey's was a metal. And you remember, if you have a semiconductor, some people have claimed that they see the turnover because the semiconductor depends on whether it's doped or not, you know, how close the levels are. You can have a situation which is like the ordinary thing and you know, not have the continuum of levels that you do in a metal.
All right, so you have to have a density of states that has features in it
That's right.
to do that.
That was the
Okay,
interpretation that was given.
thank you.
Yeah, good.
No more questions? So, thank you again.
Okay, welcome.
For,
Thank you.
accept this.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Oh, shall we disconnect this
yeah.
or?